This month's feature presentation of the Society of Barley Engineers was hosted by SoCal Brewing Supply. With a wide range of brewing supplies, SoCal Brewing Supply has you covered. Take advantage of their same-day flat rate shipping or local pickup from their Vista, California location. SoCal Brewing Supply can ensure you have what you need for your next brew day.
Okay, so fermentation control. A couple months back, Todd asked if I could give the presentation this month on fermentation control. I thought, yeah, great, until I started looking into fermentation control. There was a lot to it, so I tried to keep it under 3 hours, so please bear with me. I'm a
Hey,
home
we're not kicked out of here at 9 like we used to be, so.
Right. Yes. So I'm just a home brewer. I'm also an engineer. So one of the things about fermentation control is I research everything to the nth degree. In school, I was an engineer, but now, because of brewing, I am a chemical engineer, I'm a microbiologist. I've learned all of these different things about the cold side of brewing. Another thing, that's my home brewery logo. That's actually my family crest. It's 800 years old, from Holland. And I just flipped my name around. Van Hamersveld is Hamersveld or Hamersfield, and so I made Field Hammer out of it. I have no plans of going commercial, but it's so fun having a commercial-like experience at home. Thank you. Okay, so a great quote from Willy Wonka that so much time, so little to do. He actually ended up flipping that around because his tour, there actually was not enough time. It was way too many things to do. But it is something that applies to the fermentation side. We go through brew day, it takes forever, and then you sit and wait a couple weeks for the beer, for the yeast to do its job. So tonight I'm going to try to define what fermentation control is, give some ideas about equipment, some of the processes in it, and then tips for each step along the way, from the time that you, even before pitching, all the way to when you're going to knock out or rack. And then I'll have a couple slides about my journey and how my equipment has changed over the years as I've learned about fermentation control. So I have 3 different beer samples that'll go around tonight. The first one is the Kona Big Wave. I don't know if anybody has had this one before. I love getting this one, especially at islands. For me, it's definitely that tropical beer. It goes great with a sunset and a burger. For me, this is a really good example of a clean fermentation control. So there's not much malt, there's not much hops. It is all about making a very clean presentation of a beer, make it very easy to drink. Okay, so we've all heard the quote, the brewer makes the wort and the yeast makes the beer. Well, okay, then fermentation control is the brewer monitors and controls fermentation. All right, so as you're all enjoying the Big Wave, I really like this one. Yeah, it's super clean. I actually made a recipe very similar to this, and it got selected in the Homebrew Summer Program a couple of summers ago by Belching Beaver. They scaled it up to 18 barrels. And so my beer that was modeled after this got distributed up and down through California, and it was just a homebrew scaled up. It was a very cool experience. All right, so beginner 101 on fermentation control. Clean and sanitize everything that touches the beer. You isolate the beer from the air, especially from contaminants, with an airlock or a blow-off tube, unless it's, what was that strain you just talked about? And then clean and sanitize some more. And you've heard that over and over again as a beginner. Clean and sanitize. And it actually takes me over an hour to clean my fermenters. Clean one fermenter, and if I'm cleaning multiple fermenters, I'm in the garage for a long time. But it used to be I tried to clean really fast just to get it out of the way because I wanted to make beer. I didn't want to be cleaning. But clean and sanitize, very important step. However, the PhD in fermentation control, there is a lot that we have control over. It is not just the yeast makes the beer. Choosing the type of vessel that you ferment in, that can have an effect on the final beer. The temperature that you use, how you manage the yeast. Do you put in oxygen and nutrients at pitch? You can even add a little bit of oxygen later as well. Isolating the beer from light and air. The gravity and pH, measuring those throughout the fermentation process. Dry hopping, adding fruits and spices. Those are all things that we can do during fermentation or even post-fermentation. Yeast and hop dumps, so not just putting them in, but taking them out as a part of that, controlling that process. Using pressure. Carbonating the beer, natural carbonation, forced carbonation, bottle conditioning. There's a lot of things that can be done on that side. And then harvesting and repitching, and definitely record keeping. That's something where my fermentation control went to the next level. Keeping track of everything that I did from batch to batch helped me go back when I'm finally tasting the beer months later. I can then look at my recipe, look at all my notes on how I made it, and then make decisions on how I want to change it. And I can make small tweaks rather than big swings at a beer because I have so many notes. I can look and see, okay, I'm getting this flavor. I can look and see how that flavor might have come out by reading my notes. Okay, vessel geometry. This is really a matter of price at the homebrew level. As cheap as a plastic bucket, which I think those are probably $20, all the way up to $1,000, $1,200 for a conical, for a stainless steel conical. And there's advantages and disadvantages for each of these. So anything that's plastic can be difficult to keep clean over time. It can get etched, scratched, it can get discolored. Any one of the fermenters that has a flat bottom makes it difficult to do any kind of dumps, like pulling yeast out, pulling out hops, and it's more surface area. So more surface area for the trub that's fallen has more of a flavor effect that can affect the beer. So you want to get the beer racked off of it sooner. Conicals, different conicals have the ability to do dumps. Some of them don't. Some of them can be pressurized. Some of them can't. So just depending on what kind of features you're looking for and how much money you want to spend, there's quite a few different options for us. Temperature. Is it a karate class next door? Drums. Okay.
So it's
Rap talk with the beat. Okay, let's do temperature.
it's to keep you on pace so it doesn't run too long. Okay.
All right. It's a metronome for beer.
It is. Well, there's a music store next door, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So temperature equipment. A show of hands. How many people control temperature during fermentation? All right. That's great. I love temperature control during fermentation. That is the biggest dial we have in controlling the whole process to make a good, clean beer. So certainly monitoring and controlling is the first aspect of it, whether you use a thermal well or just a thermometer tape on the side of a carboy, using Inkbirds or any kind of a digital thermometer with a controller on it. All of those help. Then cold sources. The ability to drop the temperature or maintain the temperature, especially for a lager. Lagers need to be maintained well below a San Diego ambient temperature. So just using an air conditioner, like I could use an air conditioner in this room right now. Just having your room air conditioned or your garage air conditioned, it is a way to keep your beer cool. Ice bath, ice bottles, I've done those before. Swamp coolers, I've done that before. I never used an air conditioner, by the way, it's too expensive to chill beer. Chambers. So you can use freezers and fridges. You can just gut out all of the shelves in there and put a carboy or fermenter inside of a chamber. And then you could use glycol coils or a glycol jacket, depending on the type of fermenter that you have. Heat sources. It seemed I've worked with a number of, or been on a number of commercial tours, and most commercial breweries, I don't see heat control, the ability to raise the temperature. But I've found that to be a really important aspect of my home brewing, especially the beers that are ales that are in that high 60s range, and I want to raise the temperature a couple more degrees. In the wintertime, I can't do it without having some sort of a heat source. So a space heater, which is kind of the opposite of an air conditioner, heat lamps, a carboy wrap, which is a wrap that goes around a carboy, or heating pads, even on a conical. It's just a heating pad on the cone to be able to raise the temperature in the fermenter. One really cool low-cost way of setting all this up that I've seen is take a refrigerator and put an Inkbird on it so it controls the cooling mechanism for the refrigerator, and then put a heat lamp inside of it. And the heat lamp goes into the other plug on the Inkbird. You're then able to raise and lower the temperature of that chamber. Even though it's technically a refrigerator, it can also be a heating chamber. Okay, so why harness temperature? First of all, the strains of yeast. There's at least 4 different primary categories of yeast. I think most of us have used most of these. That's a big reason why you need to have some sort of temperature control on it, especially lagers. Lagers, you need to ferment low, and then you need to hold the temperature even lower for the lagering phase. Kveik's are kind of the opposite. Kveik's, Ryan, you said you just did one, right? 85 degrees, yeah. So in the summertime, that's great, but around Christmas, can you use a Kveik and hit that temperature? Now, the good thing about those strains is typically they're pretty low expression, so you can get away with low temperature, high temperature, right? I've only used them once. And they're pretty clean, regardless of temperature, right? Okay. And then processes. So there's different processes that we can apply as brewers in using temperature. When you dry hop, I typically dry hop at the end, near the end of fermentation, so temperature is usually at its peak, maybe with an ale around 70, 72 degrees. But I've heard a number of brewers, especially commercial brewers, will drop down into the 60s, low 60s, maybe even high 50s, and dry hop there for a different kind of flavor impact from the hops. So the ability to change the temperature is important for that kind of process. Diacetyl rest. You don't want that butter flavor in your lagers. You got to have the ability to hold a low temperature for primary lager fermentation and then be able to raise it for that diacetyl rest. There are also ale strains that are prone to diacetyl, the Scottish strain and some of the English strains. So if you want to be able to control that, you need to be able to harness the temperature. Completing attenuation, completing all the conversion of the sugars. Somebody said one of the strains stalled out. It was when we were talking about the Belgian. It was a Saison, right? Yeah, so raising the temperature is one way to get the yeast to continue to metabolize the sugars. And then lagering and crashing. So lagering, very important part of making a very clean lager beer. And then crashing, putting the yeast to sleep, clarifying, dropping everything out of suspension, and getting it ready to serve, or getting it ready to carbonate, because it takes a lot less pressure at a low temperature to carbonate. So all of those processes. So I laid out a graph at the bottom, so you can kind of see the overlap and the disparity from 30 degrees up to 100 degrees.
That's a great chart. I like that. I've never seen it laid out like that before.
Thank you.
That's really good.
All right, all about yeast. You said Chris White was here? This is a huge topic. We get the little packets of yeast and we toss them right in. We're good to go. But no, there's actually a lot to it. I'm not going to go into all of this, but there's a lot that we can do with yeast. The first two are just selecting which strain and what format. Is it dry or liquid? How are we going to prepare the yeast before pitching? Or do we? Or we just throw it in straight out of the packet? When we're pitching, how much do we pitch? So what's the pitch rate? Do we do any oxygen or nutrients? And then the whole thing about viability and vitality, and that's where the microbiology starts to come in. Without a microscope, it's kind of difficult to do either of those. You have to make some guesses. Cell reproduction, this is where we get our esters. And fusel alcohols come out of cell reproduction. I really like the picture that I found online. Those green spots on that cell in the left corner there are bud scars. And the bud scars is every time it reproduces, it leaves a scar behind. It spits off a bunch of molecules, fusels and esters that come off of it, but it leaves behind a scar. And as you can tell on that cell, it doesn't have too many more times that it can reproduce before the cell is no longer vital. So it loses its health, its ability to reproduce. Flavors and off flavors, definitely yeast. Belgian strains have a lot of flavor, but not esters are not always a flavor that you're looking for in every style. And there are strains where you don't want the esters. Lager strains. Some lager strains do have esters, and so you'll want to keep it at a much lower temperature if you don't want those in there. An Italian Pilsner, you might want some of those esters, so you might ferment at a slightly higher temperature on that. Activity. So we've all seen yeast in action. We've all seen that churning motion in our carboys. We've seen our bubblers or our airlocks bubbling away. We've seen Croissant. We've seen the trub drop out. So we've seen what it looks like. There's a lot to each one of those steps that give us an indication of the progress and the health of our fermentation. Certainly in a sealed up stainless steel fermenter, we can see very little of that. We can see the bubbles, but we can't see anything else. We can see a blowout if a blowout occurs. That's never good, no matter the fermenter. Controlling temperature profiles. Like I said before, that's our number one tool on the fermentation control. Controlling how the yeast is going through its various stages, lowering and raising temperature. I've seen some lager profiles. I think it was a German brewer. They pitched low, like in the mid-40s. They then only brought it up maybe 2 or 3 degrees to about 50, and then there was a long, slow decline down to the lagering stage. They never did a diacetyl rest. They said it wasn't necessary. They said because of the amount of time that they were taking, the yeast was viable enough to metabolize all the crap that it had made along the way, the diacetyl. And then harvesting. I've only harvested once, and I ended up never using the yeast, and it's so easy to go buy yeast at a home brew shop. I have very little experience with this one. I know a number of you have done this, made slants, you've stored it, rejuvenating it. You may have a yeast strain that you've stored for a year or two and trying to bring it back to life. That's a whole area in itself that Chris White would be great as a presenter on that. Okay, sample number 2. So the first one was a clean ale. This one is a clean lager. So this one, I say the fermentation control on this is advanced because of the temperature involved. The way that they maintain the temperature, they definitely had to deal with diacetyl. And then the lagering process. Lagering in German is to store. So to store it at a cold temperature so that it gets crystal clear like that. So these guys will pass that out along the way. So at the bottom I indicate temperature control is key, and the long-term maturation or the lagering is a defining component of this beer. And if anybody has ever had this beer in Munich, you'd think it's magical. I think drinking it outside of Munich, it's a great beer. But when you drink it there, and you're in their big hall, and the band is going, and the servers are bringing out massive mugs, it's a great experience. And don't ever order the small mug. What's that? Yes. Well, there is, it's the Bavarian flag above every one of the chandeliers in the shape of a pinwheel, because that's the Nazi swastika. The Nazis took over Hofbrauhaus as their hangout. And Hofbrau was so upset about that after the war, they didn't want anybody to ever forget what the Nazis had done there, so they just painted the Bavarian flag as a pinwheel over the swastikas and left that exact shape in there. Okay, so yes. I find a lot of European beers, especially Belgian beers in the bottle, don't travel well.
Yeah, a lot of times they get some UV at some point in the process.
Yeah. So like I said, if you go drink it in Munich, it's magical. It went the long way around the earth to get here. It is actually skunky.
Yeah, it's funny how these beers can get skunky. It is though they don't have a huge amount of hops on them.
Yeah.
But, you know,
But I think it's molecules from the malt that get converted.
it's the hops, actually.
It is the hops?
Yeah, so the light skunk is also known as light straw. You're going to spit knowledge out. Let's do another mic.
Yes. We got to hear.
So the skunked beer flavor is also known as light struck, and the only way that occurs is UV light interacting with compounds in the hops. And so there's lots of myths about that. People think that Heineken got skunked by sitting in the back of their car and getting warm. It has nothing to do with temperature changes. It's entirely light. I have theories that certain breweries are intentionally skunking their beers, because I've had beers in green bottles come out of a box and still be as skunked as the same beer in a 6-pack. So yeah, some of them, they might be passing them through a UV light for consistency. And I've actually heard light beer drinkers say, "Oh, I like that skunky flavor of Heineken."
Amazing that it's sometimes the least hoppy beers, right? I mean, these beers are not really that hoppy,
No.
but they get light struck, and it just hits you really hard. You know, it's amazing. It's not like your IPAs that are getting light struck and things like that. A lot of times it's the ones that are coming from, overseas that don't have a lot of hops in them, and they end up being, skunky, light struck. And I remember when I started drinking beer, I was like, oh yeah, this is what an international lager is supposed to taste like, right? I didn't know. I mean, and you just think the skunkiness is part of the character.
Look how light these bottles are.
Yeah, they are. Okay, so the next section of the presentation are tips and tricks that I've picked up over the last 4 or 5 years at each of the different stages of fermentation. So at the very beginning is selecting which yeast strain you want to use. Or selecting at least what type of yeast and what format of yeast you want to use. So if you start with, I want to brew a particular style of beer, you are kind of locking into at least ale or lager or hybrid. Hybrid would be like the San Francisco strain, which is kind of in between a lager and an ale. Kveik is kind of a thing on its own and can be used as almost a replacement for many of the other styles. There's flavor consequences, but there's definitely huge advantages to using those strains. So picking ale strains, They generally require little to no temp control if you're in a temperate environment like San Diego. You typically go from spring to autumn. Wintertime can be a little more difficult if your garage gets down into the 50s, 60s. The ale yeast may end up dropping out and you'll stall your beer out. You can have low pitch rates. So you can use a single packet of White Labs, a single packet of whatever your favorite yeast brand is. It also has a short fermentation schedule. So you can ferment in 1 to 2 weeks and be drinking your beer. So grain to glass fairly quickly. Ale strains are also pretty forgiving for novice brewers because of these things involved. You don't need a lot of equipment to do it, and you don't need a lot of knowledge. You can just pitch it straight out of the packet and right in. Lager strains require significant temperature control in San Diego. We cannot maintain 50 degrees. Even in the wintertime, I've been to the beach so many Christmas days, and it's nice out. So making a lager in December is tough. So you have to have temperature control. It also requires high pitch rates. Anybody who's made a Doppelbock, so a beer that's over 1060 in gravity, just a 5-gallon batch would require 4 packets of White Labs at a minimum to be able to pitch that. That's, what, $60 of yeast right there, just to pitch one 5-gallon batch. And lengthy fermentation schedules. And I include in the fermentation schedule for lagers the lagering phase, because you're not drinking it yet. You are still actively controlling the whole process until you either bottle it or keg it. So it can be very long to make a really good lager. Kveiks. How many people have used a Kveik? Nice. All right, so you all have experience with up to 100 degrees, hottest summer day, and you're pitching yeast going, this is going to kill it. And no, it loves it. Virtually no off flavors, but I think that depends on the strain. I used, I think it was the White Labs Voss strain when I made I think it was I don't know, it was a blonde or something. It was an easy drinking beer. It fermented fast. It was really easy. An extremely forgiving strain. You can get away with a lot. Other than cleanliness, you got to sanitize, but you can get away with a lot on that strain. And then the hybrids. So the San Francisco strain, the White Labs 810. So making a California Common. So that requires, generally requires temperature control in San Diego because you're going to be in the low 60s typically for that. So if you do it in the wintertime, you can probably get away without temperature control and kind of squeeze one in for a couple weeks in maybe January, February. Then what format? Dry or liquid? Most of the commercial breweries, I don't know if any, oh wait, John went to one. Voodoo Child did liquid yeast, right? Or Night Parade. Every other, use liquid or dry?
Mostly dry.
Dry.
Occasional liquid for certain strains.
Oh, you do? Okay. Yeah, because one of the things about liquid is it's a large selection. You have strains from all over the world, from breweries from quite a few different places. Dry, you have fewer options, but the options are expanding. Even White Labs is making dry versions of a number of their strains. Dry has...
More for the dry. White Labs charges more for dry than wet.
Really? Well, yeah, because...
Yeah, White Lab stuff is coming from Lallemand.
Secrets. So dry, there are fewer choices, but it's typically less expensive, easy to store. I keep mine in a refrigerator anyways, but I think you can just keep it on a shelf. Long shelf life. I think it's many years that you can hang on to that. Very little preparation required. most breweries that I've been to, they say they just dump it straight into the fermenter. Although rehydration can help, and I do have a slide about rehydration. This is a good format for beginners because your chances of the packet being bad are very low. With liquid yeast, it does require cold storage. Even just transporting it home from the home brew shop to my home, I'll often bring an ice bag or an ice chest to bring it home cold so I can get the longevity out of it. It does have limited shelf life, about 6 months maximum. So I do check the dates, the manufacture dates, or the best buy dates on the packets when I buy them. You don't want it to be expired by the time you use it. I've actually had a packet that I made a starter with it, never took off. The packet itself had died, so it didn't have enough live cells left in it to even do the starter. So liquid does benefit from a starter. It wakes it up, it gets it going, and definitely at the price that we pay for liquid yeast, starters can grow a lot. So I mentioned a lager. If you want to make a lager, Greg just showed me a lager recipe. He had to make 1 trillion cells. The White Labs packets are 142 billion. He needed 8 packets for that beer, and that's only a 5-gallon beer. That's well over $100 in just the yeast alone. But he took 1 packet and he did back-to-back starters and grew it out. John and I did the same thing at Blue Fire. We did a 1-barrel Irish stout at Blue Fire. I took a single White Labs Guinness stout and grew it over and over and over again. I made like 3 trillion cells or some crazy amount for the pitch in that Irish stout, and it worked. It was really cool. $15.
How do you estimate how many cells you have?
I use software for that.
Okay.
Beersmith, Brewfather.
But do you actually look at a microscope and see, like, you take an outline of how many cells in a small number?
No. So you go off.
Why don't you repeat the question?
Okay. So the question is how do you calculate how many cells you need for the pitch? I will talk about pitching on a later slide. So why don't I answer the question at that point? Liquid yeast, also fermentation takes off quickly, although I've seen dry yeast take off real fast as well. Okay, here's the pitching amount. Right? Okay, so starters wake up the yeast. When I get a packet from the home brew shop and take it home, I have it at 40, 42 degrees. Every cell in there is dormant. It is asleep. So if I were to just pitch that straight into, or even if I left on the counter and then pitched it straight into the fermenter, there's going to be some loss. So I like to wake up the yeast and get it hungry before I pitch it in the fermenter, even if I'm doing something like an ale that's under a 1060, where I really only need a single packet of yeast. I will still make a starter just to get the yeast woken up and going. And part of that is because I had a dead packet once. And that dead packet was in the starter. But I've also had, in my early days, non-start fermentations, where I would pitch yeast in. I had the smack packs from Y Yeast. I didn't know what I was doing with those, and I may have smacked it wrong or didn't do it right. And pitched it in. 2 days later, no activity at all. And everybody online said, just give it more time. It'll wake up and get going. I finally just bought another packet and pitched it in there and got going again. So for me, a starter is insurance. If I'm going to spend the money on $15 out of a 5-gallon batch, most of my batches are under $50 for all the other ingredients. So yeast is the most expensive ingredient. So I use these as my insurance. Okay, so to calculate how many cells you need, you break it down into ales and lagers is the first thing you break down on the front here. The next thing you break it down by is how much sugar is in there. The more sugar, the more cells that you need to metabolize that sugar. So general rule of thumb is at 1060 for your gravity. which is 15 Plato, if you do Plato. So depending on which of those, there's an amount of cells that you should pitch to have a typical fermentation for that strain. So 0.75 million cells per milliliter of wort per degree Plato. So if you had a 1060 at 15 Plato, 15 Plato at, I forget how many milliliters, there's a little over 19 liters in 5 gallons, so 19,000 milliliters. So you have 0.75 million cells times all those milliliters, the 19,000 milliliters, times the 15 Plato would tell you how many cells you need for the pitch in that beer. And you can take any gravity level and run it through that calculation. You just convert the gravity into Plato, and then if you know how much wort you have in milliliters, then you can just run that calculation. So 0.75 is the typical for under 1060. When there's more sugar, there's more stress. So the recommendation is to go with 1 million per milliliter per degree Plato. And then lagers are double, just across the board double, 1.5 and 2.0, depending on the size. So you can see on the very end, I put the starter size. So a 5.6 liter starter, I think I did that at a gravity of 1100, I think is where I calculated that one. So depending on how big your Doppelbock is going to be, you may have to put a lot of yeast in there. So to make a starter, how many people have made a starter? Nice. All right. So probably no news here. You can use the prepared cans. Those are really handy. I think it takes, it's like a 1-to-1 ratio of a can and distilled water to make your starter. Or you can boil DME. So you have water, a 10-to-1 ratio of your water in milliliters to your DME in grams. You're targeting a 1036 gravity for your starter. Use an Erlenmeyer flask with a magnetic stir plate, or as I used to do before my stir plate, I would just manually stir it. I would just pick up the flask and just swirl it around. And I'd be in the garage every 15 minutes for a long time. I put on here every hour, but I went in there every 15 minutes just to give it a good swirl. It takes about 12 to 48 hours on a stir plate. The stir plate is keeping the yeast in suspension and keeping it in contact with all the sugars. It's only a 1036 gravity. So the yeast needs to find the sugar. So that stirring keeps the yeast in contact with it. It also helps to oxygenate it as it goes. If you're just doing it without a stir plate and you're just doing my 15 minutes every now and then, go 72 hours with it and keep the temperature. I've found for whether it's a lager or an ale strain, just keep it in that 65 to 75 degree range. And you'll start to see the kreuzen. What I really look for, though, is that color. I love to see it when it gets that bright, creamy color. Then once the kreuzen has started to taper off, I'll then take it and put it in a refrigerator and keep it in there 24 to 48 hours. And all of the yeast drops to the bottom, and you get that really nice looking yeast cake at the bottom. If you then carefully decant off the top, I tried to get down to under 500 milliliters. I think Brewlosophy did a comparison where they had like a 2-liter starter where they didn't decant, and then another one where they did decant. And as with most of the Brewlosophy experiments, there was no difference. 2 liters of a spent starter has got to affect the flavor. I don't know how they got away with that. Okay, pitching, rehydration tips. We skipped one. To be honest, I've never rehydrated dry yeast, but this is a very typical way of doing it. The benefit of rehydration, I think, is the most important key here, which is when you pitch the dry yeast, the yeast being dry has no water in it, or very little moisture in it. As soon as it hits the wort, it has to try to absorb as much H2O to rehydrate itself. That kills a good portion of the cells in them trying to just come back to life again. And I think a part of that is worts are typically at 65 to 75 degrees. Rehydration is done at 95 to 105 degrees. The water can really penetrate the cells and get them going again. So you can have much more cell use out of a packet of yeast. Although what I've seen most breweries do is they just overpitch. You just put in more than you need, and it just takes off and does its thing. So rehydration is a useful tool. If it's necessary or not, I don't know, because I've never done this. All right, pitching tips. So this is the way I do it on brew day. So at the beginning of brew day, I take my starter out of the fridge. It's been in the fridge for usually 5 days max, typically around 2 to 3 days. So the yeast cake is nice and formed at the bottom, and the spent wort at the top is nice and clear. So I'll remove it from remove the starter from the fridge, and I'll decant off most of the spent wort and leave 300 to 500 milliliters at the end. One of the things that I'm careful of is I don't pour and then pull it back up and measure and then pour again, because as soon as you pull it back up again, all the yeast cake at the bottom now stirs into the wort, and now when you go and try to lower it even further, you're now losing live yeast cells. So I try to go. Andy, I actually watch when you pour your beers, your bottles, you always hold it at an angle. Is that because you're trying to keep the
If it's
like bottle condition?
bottle
Yeah.
conditioned beer, then I will keep it at an angle like this, almost like it's in a lambic basket.
Yes.
Same idea.
Is my mic dying?
No, I was getting to the mic.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I allow it to warm naturally to fermentation temperature throughout brew day. And brew day for me takes usually 6.5 to 8.5 hours. So over that time, I actually see the starter come back to life, bubbles rising on the surface again. I know that yeast is ready to go. Even with the little bit of spent wort that I left for it, it's finding sugars and getting going again. So I know when I pitch that in there, usually my fermentations kick off within the first hour. I've even seen them within the first 15 minutes start to bubble like every 30, 40 seconds or so. So I really like this technique of starters. Before pitching, make sure that the wort is at fermentation temperature or a few degrees below. You don't want to put the yeast in there when it's 100 degrees or somewhere where the yeast will just get annihilated. Or if it's too low in temperature, the yeast will go in and just fall asleep and drop to the bottom. And then it's difficult to get it going again. These next two are optional. I do the oxygenation. I used to do nutrients, but I've changed my mind on using those. Oxygenating, there is a guideline for how much oxygen to put in. I got my oxygen tank at Matheson right here in San Marcos, and I bought a regulator online for it. My regulator lets me set different flow amounts of how many liters per minute. So you're supposed to put in 1 liter of O2 for a 5-gallon batch and use a 0.5 micron stone, which is typically smaller than a carb stone. There is actually an oxygen stone that you can use for this. So the way I do it is I infuse 0.5 or half a liter per minute and do it for 2 minutes. The reason I do that is I already have my fermenter going into my my blow-off reservoir, and if I do 1 liter for 1 minute, it's blowing so hard it's splashing star sand everywhere. So if I do it at 0.5, it goes bloop 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 bloop, and I can tell it's flowing, and I'll just let it go for 2 minutes. and then stop it. Another way, I used to pick up my carboys, these big glass bottles full of 40 pounds of wort, and rock it like a baby. And, looking back on it now is probably so dangerous, but that's a technique. You can actually just swirl your fermenter to try to get oxygen in there. I've also heard of using a drill with a paddle and oxygenating it in the kettle before even putting it into the fermenter. Yeast nutrients. So zinc is the most important part from what I've heard. The reason I stopped doing this is I've heard conflicting information on whether or not the grains actually have enough nutrients for the yeast. So I've tried both ways, with nutrients and without nutrients. I have never seen a difference in the activity or the flavor for my beer. So I have this Y yeast one, and I know, Travis, you have them back here? Yes.
So is there an expiration date on the yeast nutrient?
Ooh, good question. I don't know. There's some packets back there. I can't tell from the picture. Judy, right in front of you, those blue, yeah, so you can see on there. That's a really good question. I don't know, because mine, I have that same exact tube, and mine's now about 3 years old. I would think zinc probably has stability, but I don't know what
Yeah,
else
it
is
just
in
looks
there.
like there's a manufacturing date on it. But I was just curious if anyone knew if there was a
Chris might.
shelf life with it.
For straight zinc, I would definitely say there's no shelf life. The yeast nutrient that you're talking to has zinc among many other things, but I think it's mostly dead yeast, which is already dead. I'll say like you probably don't need most of the nutrients that are in that. What you need is pure zinc. If anyone wants the document from Jamil Zainasheff, he did a lot of research on this. He made yeast kits for quaff, diluted yeast, and basically he determined that zinc is the only nutrient that beer wort is devoid of. And so that's the only thing that really matters. And so I adamantly use zinc in my brewery. I think it's the most important thing that you can add to your beer wort, and really the only thing you need to add. So, but you can get liquid zinc. If we wanted to do buy for the club, we can buy like an 8-ounce bottle. That's enough for like a few thousand gallons of beer. It's probably like 10,000 gallons of beer worth, and we can divide that up amongst the club.
And the zinc can be added to the kettle or the fermenter. Typically in the kettle, you have to double the amount you put in because there will be precipitation.
Yeah, that's exactly what Jamil found, and so we switched to adding it to the kettle just because it gets tied up in the trube.
Right. So you put in the fermenter? Yeah.
So my understanding of the zinc thing was that especially if you're repitching yeast, like maybe you fermented a beer and you're going to ferment a second beer on top of that yeast or use some of that yeast, that it becomes more important.
That could be. I always use a fresh pitch, so maybe that's why I never saw a difference. Chris, how many generations deep do you go?
It depends. We've gone like 6 before, but it just depends on what beers we're making and what yeast we're using.
Right.
And a lot of times we're just doing more variety versus trying to reuse yeast.
Okay, some... yes.
So if we want to pitch just pure zinc, where do we get that for? And so what am I looking for on Unsign?
Let's do that on the email list.
Okay.
Yeah, and I heard a comment over here. It does have to be diluted down. I measure out only 2.2 grams, which is like barely the size of a dime on my scale, for 5 gallons of this. And this has all kinds of other stuff in it. So the amount of zinc you'd use would be so small. So if you made a solution out of it and make it more easy to measure.
5.2 milliliters for 10 barrels.
Yeah.
He said 5.2 milliliters for 10 barrels. Yeah, so think about the scale.
Yeah, 5.2 milliliters for 10 barrels and half that for a lager. It
So
actually
divide
uses
by
less for a lager.
60
Yeah,
to get
so
down to our size.
yeah, so you're talking like not even a drop. So for homebrew scale, you dilute it, and then you use like a 1 milliliter dropper to do, I forget the numbers on the homebrew scale, but it's basically like 0.1 milliliter per gallon if you dilute it right. So the quaff kits were diluted so that a 5-gallon batch would use a half a milliliter of the diluted version. And for I don't know, $20 on Amazon, you can get a bottle that will make a couple of 1,000 gallons.
So maybe part of Lambic Brewing Day can be part of Zinc Distribution Day. All right, temperature tips. So when working with a new strain, I always look at the temperature range for that strain and if I've never used that strain before, I will ferment within its range. Now, within its range, I may be looking for making it more estery on the high side or more phenolic on the low side, but typically stay within the range when you're using a new strain. Then you can start to experiment and go beyond that. To get full attenuation, so for ales, when I get to a few points from terminal, I'll start to raise the temperature about 4 to 6 degrees into the low to mid 70s to get the yeast to continue to eat more and more of the sugars. Since I started doing this, I have never had a stall. Also, I found that as the yeast is consuming sugars, it's making all kinds of molecules, not just ethanol, but all kinds of things. And the yeast will go back and continue to metabolize the smaller and smaller molecules that it had made in previous stages. The only way that you can do that is the yeast has to stay active, and stressing it with temperature, even just 4 to 6 degrees, is enough to get it to finish out and clean up its mess. Diacetyl rest. So for lagers and some ales, some of the English and the Scottish strains, raising the temperature for a few days will help the yeast to metabolize the diacetyl. For lagers, I always go up to 62 degrees. I typically do primary fermentation at 50 degrees, and then we'll raise it up to 62 for diacetyl rest. There is a diacetyl test that you can do at home with your microwave. If anybody has ever done this test, you pull 2 samples from your fermenter. One of them you put in the microwave, I forget how long, 10 seconds or something. You just heating it up to make it start to steam a little bit. You pull it out, and if both samples taste the same, diacetyl is gone. If you can really taste the diacetyl in the heated up version, you know you still have diacetyl, leave it in the fermenter. Let the yeast keep working on it. So don't take the beer off of the yeast cake. Let it keep going. There are expressive strains. Most of the Belgian strains and the Hefeweizen strains. In general, for these strains, lower temperatures are phenolic, spicy. Higher temperatures are estery, fruity. That's not consistent across all strains, but that is typically what you can look for. Most of my Belgians, like the Belgian triple I passed around, I think I fermented that at 63 degrees, so really low. And I only let it sit for a couple days and then started to raise the temperature because I wanted to draw out some of the esters along the way. So I'm really trying to control that curve of what the yeast is doing with all the sugar. So when it first goes in, it has a lot of sugar. I want to bring out some of the spices that are in those strains and then slowly bring out the fruits to get it right to that balance that I'm looking for. Avoid high temperatures. In my early days when I had no temperature control, I used to love seeing my carboy just have a hurricane of activity going. And it ended up making the worst possible beer because all of that hurricane was fusel alcohol, and I would just taste solvent after making it. It was not good. So avoiding the high temperatures. You can hit high temperatures on a Kveik, and you can also hit high temperatures very late in fermentation with ales, but that's only to help finish off the attenuation and the cleanup. Quick drops. So dropping the temperature quickly, the yeast will go to sleep. It'll drop out of suspension, and it will prevent it from doing some things that you may want it to do, like bottle conditioning. If you drop too much yeast out, you can't bottle condition unless you do a priming yeast along with your priming sugar. So dropping the temperature slowly, under 5 degrees per day until you get it down to the point that you're looking for. Like if you're crashing it and you want to get it down to under 40 degrees, just go slowly with it, and that'll help keep some of the yeast in suspension for cleanup or later use like conditioning. There is a warning about crashing, though. There's this phenomenon called suckback, which I first saw on a carboy. I had not just a, well, I first saw it on one of my little airlocks. I put the fermenter into the fridge to crash it and went back later and saw my airlock was empty. All the star sand was gone. Well, at the time, I thought it evaporated. But no, it got sucked in. Later, I had a blow-off tube into a larger reservoir of star sand. That got sucked up. That beer got ruined. The real warning is anybody that has a pressure-capable fermenter and you've sealed it up to prevent any oxygen from hitting the beer, and then you cold crash it, you can implode your fermenter. Fermenters are built for positive pressure, not negative pressure. And every now and then on Instagram, I see even a commercial brewery with a collapsed fermenter because they had closed it up and they crashed it.
If you had acid caustic and suck back, and that's where it crashes most of the time.
Oh, I didn't know about that one. So the trick around that is if it's a pressure-capable fermenter, just add some PSI. I do 5 to 10 PSI of positive pressure because I will typically lose about 5 to 8 PSI on the crash, depending on what the starting temperature was. And the suckback is caused because the wort is actually shrinking as it gets colder.
What's the airspace?
It's, yep. It's that's right. Yeah, and you don't want to see if you spend $1,000 on a stainless fermenter. You don't want to go in and see it collapsed one day. There's no recovery from it. Okay, so a typical ale profile that I'll use. I'll usually ferment at a target temperature for a certain number of days. Like up 4 to 10 days for the primary fermentation. Then I'll ramp for completing the attenuation and any cleanup. So as the bubbles start to diminish, usually around a bubble every 10 seconds or so, then I'll start to ramp the temperature. Now, that's just a rule of thumb. I actually do break my own rule on different strains if I want to try to bring out different flavors. So if I'm trying to bring out some esters in a style, I will start to raise it earlier. Allow cleanup. I've seen a number of online forums where people say, "Oh, this finished fermenting in 2 days. I then kegged it." Well, yeah, it may have eaten all the sugars and made all the ethanol it can make, but in the process, it created all this other stuff that you now just put into your keg or in your bottles. So allow the yeast to finish its job, and it'll clean everything up. That's why a lager is so crisp and clean and bright, because it's been left. There is still yeast at 40 degrees doing its job for months. I usually target 2 weeks. Actually, I think all my ales are 2 weeks. So this is the fermentation profile that I use on the Irish Red that I passed around. So I did 63 degrees for 3 days. Then I started the slow ramp to 71 degrees. I do 2 degrees a day on ramping. So I don't want to cook the yeast. I slowly raise it to get it more and more active until I hit in that low to mid 70s. And then I'll hold it there to just allow it to finish. I probably could realistically only hold it for 2 days there, but I've just made all my recipes rounded out at 2 weeks before I'll do any crashing or any crashing in this case. Lagers are pretty much the same thing with the addition of the diacetyl rest. So for that, I'll go for, I always go 7 days at 50 degrees. The only variation on that is my Italian Pilsner. I do that at 55 degrees to bring out a little esters to help balance the hops. All the rest of them, I do 50 degrees. I go 7 days, and then I'll start a slow ramp, 2 degrees a day until I hit 62. And then I just let it ride until it finishes 3 weeks for primary fermentation. At that point, it goes into lagering, and lagering is a really important step. I've heard home brewers skipping this step. They'll use a lager strain. They'll get to the end of primary fermentation and then just bottle it and say it's a lager. But the lagering process, it's why this style even exists. It was lagered like 800 years ago in some cellar in Germany through the wintertime because they wanted to make beer year-round, not just during the summer. And they got this crystal clear, super delicious beer in the springtime. So that is a very important step. I use 4 weeks minimum. Often I'll go up to 8 weeks before I'll move it into a keg. And yes, and I actually put that. I put option. The beer. So if you have fermenter limitation, because this will hold up your fermenter for a long time. So an option is go ahead and take it off of the yeast keg, put it in a keg, and let it continue in the keg. But don't do clarifying or anything else. Just let the yeast remain in there and do its job, and hold it at about 40 degrees. I think I lager at 38. Yeah, I lager at 38. And I think Hofbrau lagers about 2.5 months on theirs before skunking it. Okay, dry hopping. So selecting which, like I said, fermentation control, there are so many different steps in fermentation control. This is technically not fermentation, but can impact fermentation and can take advantage of fermentation. So selecting which stage, biotransformation, if you dry hop your hops in days 0 to 4, the yeast can metabolize some of the phenols and convert them into these fruity flavors. So a hazy IPA can really benefit from biotransformation. The other 2 points are pre-terminal, so a few points from final gravity, or post-terminal, which is the classic way of doing it. Day 10, day 14, and you throw your hops in. I pretty much do all of my dry hopping on the pre-terminal. I do have biotransformation on a couple of my IPAs, definitely on the hazy, to try to bring out a little bit of the biotransformation. So determining how much to put in, 1 to 2 ounces per gallon is a good starting point. Regardless of what hop varieties you put in, you can mix them all up, but have the total amount be somewhere between 5 ounces and 10 ounces for a 5-gallon batch. If pre or post-terminal, rousing the hops. So once you put them into the fermenter, they'll drop to the bottom. And then if they're pre-terminal, there'll still be some yeast there to help metabolize the oxygen that you just put in. But also that yeast can help bring some of those hops back up off of the bottom. But rousing the hops can really help. So in a conical fermenter, you can pump CO2 into the bottom, and so you do it periodically just to get those hops to resuspend. If you have them in a hop bag in your fermenter, if you can get your fermenter shaken or bounce that bag in any way, you can get the wort to transfer through the hops again. So that's to extract as many of the essential oils as you can for the aroma. I used to not remove my hops from my fermenter, and most of my beers had a grassy bite to them. And then I think it was a talk by Kelsey, maybe, that I learned about removing the hops. So contact time, how long do the hops contact with the beer? I try to keep within 2 to 3 days of contact time, so it pulls the oils out, but all of the vegetable matter or vegetal matter that's in the hops doesn't leach more flavors into the beer. So there's a couple ways to do it. In a conical, you can just open the valve at the bottom and make a huge mess. If you have them in a bag, you can pull the bag out. The risk is don't oxygenate the beer, so definitely be careful with that. You can crash the temperature to try to get the yeast to drop to the bottom. In any of the conical fermenters, that will help condense it down into a smaller cone at the bottom. On any of the flat fermenters, it will drop to the bottom, but it's still a pretty big surface area. So another thing you can do is just rack the beer off of it. So put it into a second fermenter. There is definitely risk of oxidation at that point, and anything that's been dry hopped is one of the most at-risk beers for oxidation. So that is a risky move to do that. So if you're in a fermenter where you can't remove the hops, put them in 3 days before you intend to rack that beer into bottles or into a keg. That way you don't have that contact time. Prevent adding oxygen, atmosphere. Okay, so the amount of atmosphere that it takes to ruin any of our beers at our scale is 1 cubic centimeter of atmosphere. You can have that in a racking tube. You can have that stuck in your carbonation stone. You can have that by when you're dry hopping and you just dump the hops in and the hops are just kind of pulling some air in. It is so easy to add 1 cubic centimeter of air to 5 gallons, and then the beer will only last a couple of months before it is very oxidized.
Maybe that's the argument for not doing the post-terminal, dry hopping, because I don't know.
I've stopped post-terminal because I was worried about that.
I don't do it either, and I noticed, and I got a lot better IPAs when I stopped doing it.
Same here, yeah. So I go pre-terminal so that the yeast can help metabolize any oxygen that's added in.
If there's still fermentation going on there, it'll drive all the oxygen.
Yeah, yes. And I've heard as soon as like 2/3 of fermentation. So in that last third of fermentation is a good time to do the pre-terminal. All right, measurements. Really the big takeaway on this, I learned that the refractometer is no good once fermentation starts. The only thing the refractometer is good for after fermentation starts is to see is there any change from the day before. But the absolute value it gives you, your beer is not at 1010 like the refractometer says. It's like at 1014, 1015. Using a hydrometer post-fermentation is really the only way to go, unless you have an easy dens or some sort of a digital. Even the floating hydrometers, the wireless ones like a Tilt, have variability in them. If anybody's used one of those and watched the graph it's following an average curve, but any instantaneous measurement, it has bobbing in it. So I always use now just a regular hydrometer for my final. Yes?
If you're brewing in a carboy, like regular glass carboy, plastic carboy, you always risk adding oxygen when you go to take your sample.
Yeah, so if you're going to thief it, it's you run the risk of adding oxygen. So even I have conicals at home. Because you have to draw so much to do a floating hydrometer, I only do it once when I know all activity is done. So I only measure it once now. I don't measure progress along the way. I watch the bubbles for activity to kind of gauge what the progress is. That's why I like the tilts, because they help you. Yes. It's a good monitor, so you can see if you want to be like precisely at 10% left of fermentation, you want to dry hop. Tilt will show you exactly where that 10% point is.
Yeah, and it's good because you're measuring over a longer period of time. Even though it is bouncing around because of dissolved CO2 in there, it still gives you, it may not be, exactly on the, the measurement, but you at least know that it's within a point or two, if
Right.
even that. So
And when you hit terminal, if you just let the tilt sit in there for 6 hours, it'll give you enough average points that you can go, okay, I am at 10, 12.
yeah, it's scaling over time, so you're able to figure out where exactly it is in that.
Right.
Yeah.
It is important also, the temperature that you measure at has to be at the calibration temperature of your tool. I have tried the calculators to convert, and they are several to many points off when I run them through those calculations. So samples should be at 60 degrees or whatever your tool is calibrated for, spot on. I even had a problem with my pH meter where I would draw a sample from my boil kettle and cool it down to anywhere between 70 to 76 degrees, and I put my pH meter in it, and the pH would continue to change as I was watching it. It would never be steady. But then I was watching the temperature, and the temperature was continuing to drop slightly down to room temperature. So that drift was causing me to misread my pH meter. So now, getting it down to that calibration point, all my tools give me really accurate numbers now. I badmouth the refractometer. That is my #1 tool on brew day. It is great pre-fermentation. You just draw a couple of drops out, put them on that plate. Temperature is really important on that one. If you put them on hot and take a look at it, you will be many, many points below what it actually is. You let it cool, and that will rise. One tip about the refractometer, if you've ever looked in it and seen the line really fuzzy, that's because the sample is too thick. You can try squeezing the plate down, and that will thin it out, or clean it off, wipe it all down, and put fewer drops on it the next time, and it'll make a much more crisp line. And calibrate your hydrometer with your refractometer.
Quick question
Yes.
about the refractometer. So what was the reasoning once you started fermentation that it's not working? Is it because the yeast content?
No, it's because the alcohol. So the
Okay.
alcohol is lighter than water. The refractometer is refracting the sugars that are in it, but it assumes that the liquid that the sugars are suspended in is water, which is a 1.000 gravity. Alcohol is 0.9 or 0.9 something. So being lighter than water, it throws the refractometer off. It's refracting the light differently. So you read the number much much higher than it is. You then put it into a calculator and you say, this was my OG, and it'll try to come up with, okay, this is what your actual is at. I've never found it to be accurate compared to the hydrometer. But on brew day, when I compare hydrometer to refractometer, I have them dialed in perfectly. So it is the alcohol that's throwing it off.
Awesome. Thanks.
Oh, it's that low. Wow.
So point 8 was what Derek said.
No. No, you're like 5%, 4%, but isn't that, but isn't it that throw it up? Infection avoidance. I always have a spray bottle of Star San, always ready. I spray it on everything, everything that's cold side. Hot side, on your brew house, the flame kills everything. But once the beer is cold, the wort is cold, and in the fermenter, I spray everything. Anything that I touch, anything that touches the beer, everything gets sprayed down. Even the faucets on my keezers, I spray those after every use. So I keep a prepared bottle. The acidity, if you've ever measured the pH on Star San, it will stay under 3 pH. I think 2.3 is usually what I see. 2.3 pH for weeks, if not months. And it is a viable sanitizer that far in. However, there is a detergent that Star San puts in to help it penetrate into crevices, just like soap softens water so it can penetrate into surfaces to make them clean. Their detergent helps penetrate into cracks and crevices in your equipment for the sanitation. Yes, sorry, first Louis.
Chris, yes, real quick. So when you say you've seen this last for weeks or months at that below 3 pH, is that using like RO water or tap water?
I use tap water. I use Valicitos water, which is typically pretty low.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, 'cause that's good to know actually. Because yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, they say to use like distilled RO water, whatever, to to keep it staying effective for much longer.
Yeah.
And so
But
maybe
it's still
it does
that
still work
detergent.
well for.
I don't rely on the detergent so much. Stainless steel is pretty hard to etch. Plastics, much easier, so that detergent really helps with that. My practice is I clean kegs once a month, the beginning of every month. And the beginning of every month, it requires 5 gallons of Star San to purge a keg. So I will make a fresh bucket at the beginning of the month. I'll go through and purge my kegs, and now I have this great 5-gallon bucket of Star San that I will use for the rest of that month. I keep my my spray bottle filled with it. I'll dunk any pieces of equipment in that bucket. It's really handy having 5 gallons of it. And then I'll just dump that out at the end of next month and clean more kegs and purge those. That's about an ounce of Star San a month that I'm using. Yes. Chris.
Yeah, so my comment on that. Here, Chris. My comment on the Star San is that what I've learned is that the cloudiness you see, if you use a tap water to make that and it gets cloudy right away, that's the detergent portion reacting with the minerals in the water and the detergent coming out of solution. And so if Star San is clear, if you make it with RO distilled water, it will stay clear for months, maybe even years. And that is in a good state as long as the pH tests well, get a set of pH strips that measure in the acidic range, check that it's below like 2.5, 3. I mean, generally it should be 2.3 to 2.5. So if it's not getting cloudy, it's worth investing. If you have an RO water system, then just use RO water or go to the store and get RO water, distilled water, and it will last a really long time. Generally, when I'm dumping Star San, it's because it's collected like some dirt and dust in the bottom over time. And so it's been a couple of months, and so that's when I swap it. It doesn't get cloudy if you're using RO water in it.
Interesting. Yeah, mine's cloudy instantly because I'm using tap
because you're
water.
using hard tap water.
Yeah.
I was just going to, responding, Louis, to your question there, is that we use the Star San for our lambic brew sessions for, when we're fermenting with them, and it sits outside for months and months, and nothing grows in them. And you try that with anything else, and you can't get anything to do that. And so, is it hazy? No, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, even stuff drops in it, like leaves and things like that, but it doesn't really. But it doesn't. You can see there's nothing really growing in it, so it's still working. So that's pretty impressive. And I know I like what I do is I keep my kegs just sitting there with Star San in them. And then I will rack out of them or transfer out of them under pressure so that I have no oxygen in there. And I'll transfer it into another keg that it will sit with Star San in it. And I will keep the Star San for quite a long time, just reusing it. And like Chris mentioned, when it starts to sort of pick up, color from other things that you've gone from one container to another container so many times, eventually I'll let it go. But it's amazing how long it will actually last.
Mm-hmm. All right, when things go wrong, I've had some of these things, probably a good portion of these have all happened to me at some point. Probably to a bunch of you as well. So no start or slow start on fermentation. So the pitch rate could have been too low. So not enough cells going in. The yeast could have not been that alive. Maybe you had a full packet, but it was only like 20% of it was still alive. Not enough oxygen or nutrients, or you pitched too hot or too cold. A stall well before final gravity. The temperature could have been too low. The yeast just dropped out. It just gave up. Or there was not enough oxygen or nutrients. Pitch rate could have been too low. I've only had that happen to me once, and I believe it was a Belgian strain. Wait.
Pressure too high.
Pressure too high. Pressure too high. Blowout. So I actually had a blowout of bananas, a banana ale once. I still have banana fragments on my ceiling of the garage. I put a banana puree into a carboy. I think it was about halfway through fermentation. The yeast got a hold of all those sugars and blew up. It was a huge mess. Typically, I have blowouts now because of hops, not because of a fruit addition. Off flavors. There's a great number of these. You will see these listed on your competition score sheets. There's usually a reason why it occurred, a reason where we need to clean up our processes, our fermentation control to get rid of these. I do have skunk on there. I would say the one that affected me the most in the early days was the solvent paint thinner, because I was doing Belgians and letting the temperature just go crazy. And it just created so much fusel alcohol. The one I struggle with now is oxidation. That 1 cubic centimeter of oxygen is so hard to find in your system when you have to transfer from vessel to vessel along the way. All right, final sample. And then we'll go into my journey, which goes really quick. So this final beer, Triple Carmelite, the beer that I passed out earlier was my version of a Triple Carmelite. This is from the Carmelite monks in Dendermonde, Belgium, a part of Flanders. They're from the 1690s, 1670s. Is when the monks were first making this. The recipe was lost to time. In the 1990s, Bastiles found an old grain bill or an old grain order form from the monastery that kind of indicated what portions of these different grains they were using, and it was 3 different grains. It's unlike a normal Belgian triple. It is barley, wheat, and oats. I think in the monks they had it as barley, wheat, and spelt, and it got kind of converted into oats to make it an easier grain for everyone to use. The trick with this one is getting the fermentation control just right. Bastiles, they have a proprietary yeast strain. They go to so much effort to protect their strain that they will actually pitch a different strain into each bottle so that anybody that tries to scrape the dregs can't get their yeast. John tried to scrape a bottle of this and it didn't work. Those question? So this is definitely a yeast-driven ale. I call this an expert fermentation control because of how difficult it is to get Belgian yeast to express properly. I don't like it when it's overly phenolic. I don't like it when it's overly ester. I don't mind if a Belgian triple is one or the other or a blend of the two, but it has to be in balance with the malt and the little bit of hops that they put in. I believe they use Saaz in their recipe for just a touch of hops at the end.
Is there any more of your triple compared to this?
Yes, if you want to try it, John can pull it out of there.
Yeah, because for me, I'm picking up a heavier phenol character on this,
Yeah, I think that theirs was more phenolic.
which I don't know if that's, it's not a good or a bad thing.
Right, it's just different.
It's just different.
Yeah. And since their strain, They actually they say they use a blend of strains, and they won't say where they got those from or how they prepare them, how they maintain them, but they do blend it apparently live for each batch.
But how good your beer isn't a measure of how close you come to this.
No.
It's like you make it what you want.
So I go for balance, the same way they go for balance. In America, I've tried as many different Belgian triples as I could find from American breweries. I've only found 2 that I like. You've probably all had North Coast Prankster, and the other one is Allagash Curio. Those are the most authentic outside of Belgian. Yeah, it is. Yeah, they're the base triple, right. Okay, so my journey. These are my first couple of batches. This was back in 2019. I had just come back from a trip to Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. The year before that was Belgium. So within a span of 12 months, I went to the birthplace of 2 of these amazing beer styles. And so after that second trip, I bought my first kit. It was a 6.5 gallon carboy. It was an American brown was the style. I still have a bottle in my closet from that first batch. It'll go into the Fieldhammer Museum. No, I'm never opening it. And that was it right there. That was the American brown. I tried putting it in the bathtub, putting a towel around it to prevent light. Just the few things that I knew at the time. You can see the third picture over. That one actually blew out. It just croissant all the way out the top. And so then I went with a blow-off tube on the last one. No temperature control, and the last 3 are all Belgian, so they all just went off. Then I tried swamp coolers. So a swamp cooler is you put the carboy into a basin of water and then just put a T-shirt over it. The T-shirt acts like a wick in a candle, and it will wick the water up, and then the evaporation process is the swamp cooler. I did find that was able to cool up to 5 degrees, but not during primary fermentation. The yeast was in control at that point. So then I built these insulating jackets. It was 1-inch foam. It was all stuff from Home Depot with Reflectix, which is just an insulation material. I made these beautiful Velcro sealed up wrappers around all of my fermenters, which was great for keeping heat out, but also great for keeping heat in. So that didn't work. I also started making starters. So this is now in 2020. Okay, so now I started some active temperature control. So I got an ice chest, I got a couple pumps, and I got these really cool things called cool sticks. Cool sticks go right into the top of a carboy. You can see they go right into the top of a carboy, along with the thermal well. And so I was able to have the Inkbird monitor the temperature and then run ice water. I just ran ice water through these sticks. These sticks, though, this is such a huge volume of liquid, and the cool stick was only about a 1/2 inch wide. It had 2 tubes, a tube on the inside for the liquid to go down, and then the tube on the outside for it to return back up. Completely closed system, so nothing ever touched the beer. This worked. I was replacing ice several times a day for days and days and days. It was a pain, but I made some really good beer with a lot of effort and a lot of trips to the store. I then decided, well, why don't I try to automate the making of the ice or the making of cold water? And I got this small refrigerator and put a basin in there, and I actually used antifreeze with it was like a makeshift glycol chiller. Had my pumps in there, had the Inkbirds on there, and had it going. The refrigerator could not keep up with fermentation.
So you're saying the secret to your beers is antifreeze?
Not in the beer.
It's a touch of flavor. That's where all that fusel alcohol came from. So this did really well for maintaining the temperature after fermentation was done. During primary fermentation, I would put ice in to assist the fridge out. So I would put some ice into. I actually had ice packs so that it wouldn't thin out my my antifreeze. So I would freeze these ice packs and put them in there, and that would help for the most part. But the whole point of that was to get away from effort, and that was still more effort. So then I did a couple of different chambers. So this one is a cooler bag, and with that one, you put ice bottles in around your beer and then zip it all up. I made a best to show lager with that, and I was replacing ice bottles every single day. We had to empty the freezer in our kitchen. My wife couldn't keep anything frozen in the kitchen for like 4 weeks while I was swapping. All those bottles, the big bottles, I went to the grocery store and I bought the cheapest soda that I could in those 2-liter bottles, dumped out all the soda, filled them with water, and I was using those, just swapping them every day. It was a tremendous effort, but it worked and made great beer. I then got a refrigerator. My oldest daughter graduated from college, and that was her dorm fridge, so I got to bring it back. I gutted out all the drawers and started to use it as a fermentation chamber. That worked great. And then the last one was, as I was starting to set up my keezer, before I put kegs in it, I decided to use it as a fermentation chamber for a while. So I was able to put several fermenters in there at a time. The key with that, though, is everything has to ferment at the same temperature. All right, and then these things are dangerous. Yes, they are. That broke in my hands. I didn't cut myself, but it was freaky. I've heard about him, but not seen any pictures. That freaked me out. This was 2021. I immediately went out, replaced everything. John, where does this quote come from? Buy once, cry once. Is that your quote? So I went with conical fermenters with a glycol chiller. Super expensive, and it was cry once, but it made life so much easier. I'm able to now not freeze ice bottles every day. I can just set the temperature where I want. I even got the Wi-Fi Inkbirds, so now when I'm on vacation, I can control my fermenters from the hotel room. So that was 2021, and then since then, I've continued to fine-tune my fermentation control, adding oxygen. I experimented with nutrients. I've improved my starters. So just all these little tips along the way. Oxygen or oxygenation is definitely the battle that I'm after right now. And I have some beers. I have one IPA that John and I made 4 months ago now. Perfectly fine. I've had other beers 3 weeks in, already darkening and having kind of that sherry flavor. So there is atmosphere somewhere leaking in. So that is it. There are so many different aspects to fermentation control. If anybody wants to deep dive into any one of them with any of the experience that I have, I'm available to discuss offline. Otherwise, cheers.
Great presentation, Chris. Thank you so much for coming out here. You didn't really. I think you touched on it with things like thermowells and things like that, but you didn't really drive the point home about where you actually measure the temperature, because the brewing fermentation is an exothermic reaction.
Right.
And I was shocked at the temperature differential that you can get.
Yes.
Inside your fermenter compared to like what your chamber might be. And so I just wondering if you wanted to make a few comments about that.
Sure, I can
people.
point out some of the pictures here. So first of all, on my insulation jacket, you can see my little flip door. So I had the sticker thermometer on there, and it would just do a like a mood ring. It would just go different colors depending on the temperature. Those are surprisingly accurate. So I could see if the beer is in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and like I said, in the early days, the hotter the temperature, I was cheering it on until I realized it was ruining my beer. So I first measured that way, and then when I switched to the Inkbirds, then I had these thermal wells, and it has it was one of the early
inside.
slides.
Now you're measuring the
so
inside
I'm measuring
temperature.
the inside. Yeah, and then where was the chamber? Okay, even on the chamber, I measured this third picture right here. You can see the cord going up and into a thermal well, and on here, the thermal well going into it. But I've also tried taping the probe on the outside of it. So it's just two different temperature points. On the outside, I find in a chamber that's chilling it from the outside, it ends up being warmer inside than on the outside. In a case where, like the cool sticks, this chills it from the inside, I would actually have to separate. You can see I have the thermal well at an angle. I would separate the thermal well from the cool stick. Otherwise, the center of the carboy would be cold, and the outside would be hot. So I would angle the probe away from it. Yes?
I just have a question. So about how do you measure the temperature? Because I just had the most obnoxious experience. So I have my Thermapen, which I tend to trust my Thermapen because I love it. But then, so in my mash tun, I have a Thermapen and I'm measuring it, and it was 10 degrees off from a thermal well that I had, evidently in the middle of the, but it's from the outside, and it's, the thermal well, and it goes into the middle of the mash tun. And I can't stick my Thermapen down into that spot. So I'm like, what do I believe? Do I believe the thing that's measuring, it's a probe that comes from the outside of the mash tun and it goes to the inside, and it's like a thermal well, right? Do I believe that, or do I believe the Thermapen, which I'm sticking into the mash from the top with the, with
There's a couple things like that.
I don't really know.
I have
Like,
both of those on my
Right,
mash tun as
right.
well. I calibrated the one on the front. I found that the one on the front is it's a mechanical one. The
Right.
Thermoped's a digital one.
Right.
The mechanical one was off.
Okay.
And so I went through the process of calibrating it. You have to heat the water,
Right.
but heat it right to the level, like just above the probe from your
Right.
mechanical thermometer, so that you can have both of them at the exact same point.
Okay.
Then whatever the Thermopen says, sometimes it'll take a special tool to turn the little calibration nut on it, but you
Okay.
can get both thermometers to agree.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the first thing.
That's
but
the
the
thing,
second
yeah.
is, depending on the geometry of your mash tun, that mechanical probe can be much lower down than where you're measuring on the top.
Right.
Now, on the top, depending on how your sparge arm is distributing, like if you're recirculating.
Right. Well, I measure it before I start sparging because I want to get it. I don't want to confound
so
it.
during mash, are you
Okay.
recirculating, or is your
well,
mash steady?
No. During the mash, I leave it, but then I sparge later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, when you first put your grains in, you will have different layers of temperature.
Right.
The hottest will be at the bottom,
Right.
especially depending on the size of your false bottom.
Right. Well,
like I have
stir it
2
real
gallons
good.
at the bottom.
Oh, I don't have anything. I have the SS mash tun, so there's like nothing at the
Nothing
bottom.
down there. You have a bazooka tube or something.
There's a tube under it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then it'll still have layers. Mine
yeah.
has 2 gallons, so I have a big thermal layer down
Okay.
there of really hot water,
Yeah.
and then it gets cooler and cooler all the way
Yeah.
up to the top.
I stir the heck out of it.
I stir
yeah.
vertically though.
I just
Pull
stir
from the
it,
bottom,
yeah,
pull
yeah.
from the bottom, pull from the bottom, and then swirl it around.
Right.
I do find though that even measuring like the 4 compass points around the mash tun, there will be a couple of degrees difference.
Right.
Just depending on how the grains have settled in there, how much you've stirred. And then if you're measuring the temperature over time, it'll cool more at the top than it will down where your mechanical one is. So you could have actually had a 10-degree difference depending on when you were measuring at the top. Also measuring closer to the edge versus towards the center, there will be a variation in that. So definitely with your thermal pen, measure all the way around. I usually look for a consensus average. If I'm shooting for 152 degrees for a single infusion, I'll put the grains in and I'll stir and stir and stir vertically to try to pull that heat from the bottom onto the top and just kind of cause a manual convection.
Right.
Call it that. Then I'll measure all the way around, and it will be a different measurement as I go all the way around and through the middle. But I look for, is everything averaging somewhere around 152? Over here it's 149, over here it's 153, but they're all going to average around what you're looking for.
Okay.
But definitely in your case, make sure that you're calibrated, and then just make sure that you've stirred enough if you're doing no circulation during the mash.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yes, Chris.
I just have a real quick story about temperature control. So I was probably less than a year in, maybe 40 or 50 batches into homebrewing back in 2010, and I realized that space taken up by an end table in my living room could maybe be replaced by a 7 cubic foot chest freezer.
Yeah.
So I asked my roommate at the time, what do you think about replacing this end table with a chest freezer that we can put a lamp on? And he told me, whatever makes better beer, go for it.
All right, any other questions? Yes, Jim.
A comment, then a question.
Okay.
On your red and your triple, they were both excellent beers. I really love the red. The triple reminded me of one of the best triples I ever had. It was about 8 years ago, I think. But
Do you remember what triple that was?
You know, I don't know who made it, but it was I was talking to Andy about it.
What you were saying?
No, it was a commercial beer, and it was at either the last or the second of the last the Stone Festival, where we were serving sodas. We were only allowed to serve sodas, but we got to sample plenty of good professional beers. And there was a quad there, and Andy and I had this quad at the same time, and we both agreed it was the best beer here. And like 20 minutes later, we ran across this triple, and it was the best triple ever. But your triple reminded me of that triple. And it was
Wow,
about
thank you
7 or
very
8,
much
yeah.
for that.
But my question is, on lagers, if God said you can only have one temperature in lagers, what would it be?
For the entire time, I would go 50 all the way.
Okay, yeah. I agree.
Even the lagering, just let it lager at 50. And I would have to serve at 50, it sounds like, as well. If I only have one.
Yeah, okay.
Ideally, you serve a lager at a cold temperature, but
No, but you can always bring it up.
but
yeah.
50 long enough, it will consume all the diacetyl. You just have to give it enough time.
Yeah, that's what they did in the caves back in the day.
Right,
So,
right. And that's one of the things that I find most amazing about brewing is 5,000 years of brewing. I think I just read that a brewer just found some yeast in a Babylonian or Egyptian vessel, and it's like 3,000 years old, and they were able to resurrect the yeast and make beer out of it. But it's only been like the last 150 years that we've understood the science behind it. Hops are only about 500 years old.
They didn't know about germs until
Right.
Or 100 years ago.
Thermal pens, right.
Ink birds, yeah.
No, they didn't know existed. Yeah, they had their magic spoon, and then they would rack beer and put more beer on top of the gunk that was there, the troop, and they would just bring it all back to life again. Yes.
Well, on that note, are there any more questions? All right, let's give a big hand to Chris.
Thank you very much.